We're excited to be presenting this event right now, but also a little bit saddened, obviously, by the recent events and the human suffering going on right now in the Ukraine, as well as here at home with the ongoing discovery of unmarked mass graves at many residential schools and the ongoing struggles for Black and Indigenous communities as it relates to racial and social justice. So a lot going on. These are the legacies of a colonial past that Canada has that we must continue to recognize and to continue to work through. And what's become clear to me, and I'm sure to many of you in light of recent events, is the need and the power of allyship and solidarity amongst marginalized groups. And that solidarity is something I think we'll dive into a little bit tonight as all of our speakers share their insights and their thoughts. I want to thank Audrey Hudson and Karen Riccole for helping me to shape tonight's discussion and for meeting with me over the last few months and for shepherding these discussions over the last 3 years, as well as Michael Belmore and Quentin Versity for joining us tonight and agreeing to participate. As I mentioned, Audrey and Karen have been on this journey with me for 3 years since its inception, and it wouldn't be possible without their participation. If any of you joined us last year, you may recall that Lisa Jackson, who was one of our panelists, spoke a lot about lichen last year. And so I think it's quite appropriate that we now switch to rock to discuss in our tonight's topic, Rock as Witness. Just a couple of housekeeping pieces. We're recording this event, as the Zoom lady just said. We'll ask you if you can to turn, I believe your mics have been turned off from our end, but also potentially your cameras, because it can be distracting sometimes for the speakers. We're all in a community. This is not a webinar, so this is sort of set up as an open meeting. So we just ask that you follow respectful community guidelines. There'll be a Q&A at the end of the discussion, but we welcome your comments. Myself and my colleague Njoki will be sending some of your comments to the speakers and moderators as we see them come up. We'll do our best to do that. And I think that's all the housekeeping stuff. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pass things off to my colleague Njoki for the land acknowledgement and the speaker introductions. Thanks, Njoki.
Thank you, Zoe, for the kind introductions. I would first like to begin with giving a land acknowledgement before we commence the event. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And also, we also acknowledge the African ancestors who were forcibly brought to Canada and give their labor for free in this land. And we acknowledge that their descendants are still grappling with the legacies of slavery. So having been born and raised in Nairobi, Kenya, and having come to Canada for my postgraduate education, I must say that my relationship to this land has changed the more I've settled here in Canada. I once viewed Canada as a land of opportunity that is open to the dreams and progress of immigrants. But as I further settled and became open and more educated to the Indigenous history that was pervasive even before what we knew of to be Canada, I've come to further realize that the core history of Indigenous peoples and the land whose land this belongs to is often overshadowed and even worse, ignored. Now I see this land as what it truly is, and that is beautiful Indigenous land that rightly belongs to Indigenous peoples. With that being said, it is my wish that we all deeply reflect on our relationship to the land by which this event takes place on. And may we even have a deeper reflection to our relationship to Indigenous peoples. With that being said, welcome to the Exploring Black and Indigenous Futurisms. I'd like to give a warm welcome to the speakers today. First, we have Dr. Audrey Hudson. Dr. Audrey Hudson holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Most recently, Dr. Hudson co-edited a groundbreaking text titled In This Together, Blackness, Indigeneity, and Hip Hop, with a chapter entitled All Eyes on Hip Hop, Afrofuturism, and Indigenous Futures. She is also the Chief Education and Programming at the Art Gallery of Ontario, otherwise known as the AGO. And she also teaches Black Canadian Studies at the University of Toronto. Next, we also have Dr. Karen Riccole. Karen is an urban Cree residing in the traditional territories of the Putin, Wendat, Mississaugas of the New Credit, Deschutes-Wanspoon Treaty Territory. Karen's research explores the various intersections of Indigenous artistic activations rooted in the multiple layered Indigenous territories that are urban spaces. She's also a professor here at the Women and Gender Studies Department at the University of Toronto. We welcome the panelists, and these panelists will also further welcome the other panelists that we have attended today.
Good. Thank you, Njoki. Hello, everyone. Good to see you. Let me see if oh, there's Karen. Okay. There's my sister. There's a lot of people on screen, and so just yeah, finding each other. Thank you again. Yeah, thank you for joining us today. And you know, Karen and I, this is our third year doing this this series with Hart House, and now now in partnership with the AGO. Today we have two artists with us. We have Michael Belmore and Quentin Versetti Lindsay. Both Karen and I will introduce our two artists, and then we'll bring them on screen and we can enter into our conversation. All right, and we're going to start with, so if I could get that slide up, that intro slide, and then I'll just add, I'm going to ad lib. I know Quentin a little bit, and so so I'll do a little bit of an ad lib, not too much. I will read off screen just to keep it, you know, just to keep it all a tiny bit linear, but we're gonna go back and forth a little bit. And so Quentin is he's an artist at heart. I feel like he is one of my little brothers. I've known Quentin. I've been Quentin's professor. I've been Quentin's boss again. But we are co-editors. But more so, we are friends. Quentin is an amazing young person with a real vision for the future. He is the one person that got me on to thinking about Afrofuturism and what it could be. I remember that exact moment where I was like, oh, I'm like, this is how we can see ourselves, Quentin. I'm like, yes, this is how, as art educators, as artists, as thinkers, as Black creatives, this is how I see ourselves in the future. And so thank you to Quentin for that. Quentin has a Bachelor in Fine Arts from OCAD University and a Master's in Art Education from Concordia University. He's one of the world's leading Afrofuturists, artographers. Through his scholarly work, he has coined the term Sankophology and Rastafuturism, while creatively he exhibits imaginative futures of Blackness and representation. I can go on and on. He's won numerous awards. He's an art educator at the Art Gallery of Ontario with me right now. He's a grad. He's an entrepreneur. He's an artivist and an ever-growing interstellar tree. Those are his words. And so I welcome Quentin. And I just want to, both Karen and I have taken quotes from our artists, and so this is my quote for Quentin. Forced to become aliens to till the lands, an alien to our homelands, resist being alien to self, and we got future plans. 7 generations seed planting. See what they planting. On these plantations ain't our roots. Our solar systems never mute. So we loop the truth with the ancestors as our troops, speaking from the heart through art for the yet to bear fruit, an intergalactic salute. And that's from Quentin in 2017. All right. Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Karen.
Sure. So greetings, everybody. I hope you're happy and well. We're really lucky and personally feel incredibly honored to be in conversation tonight with both Quentin and Michael Belmore. And so it's my honor to introduce Michael to this space. Michael is a graduate of the Ontario College of Art and Design, OCAD. He completed his Master's of Fine Arts at the University of Ottawa in 2019. And I'm so excited about talking about process tonight, because I know that, well, just by the work and by the engagement, all of the public facing work that Michael's done, I can't even imagine how many hours of inward facing work, of sitting with rocks, sitting with water, thinking, rememory, like all of the process things I'm so excited to talk about. But Michael employs a variety of material and processes that at times may seem disjointed, yet the reality is that together his work and processes speak about the environment, about land, about water, and what it means to be Anishinaabe. His work has been exhibited nationally and internationally and is represented in the permanent collections of various institutions and numerous private collections. Amazing work. I love this quote here: seemingly small things, simple things inspire his work. The swing of a hammer, the warmth of a fire, the persistence of waves on a shore. Through the insinuation of these actions, a much larger consequence is inferred. And so when I was thinking alongside edifice, which I am apt to do these days, I think about this approach to haptic writing, and to think about like increasing the surface area of an experience or an encounter, the trace along a seepage and the spillage, the caress of the liquid matter or molten copper that etches these gestures and forms of moving into relation, sometimes into relation with hard spaces, sometimes willfully melting into place warmly and snugly, and tentacular falling into a pressurized, hot, molten. So tonight, I'm very excited to think alongside you all, to think about rock, and to think about rock as a materiality, but also to think about rock as a kin and kinship. So welcome, Michael Belmore. Yeah. So my friend, my sister, this is so exciting.
I know. And yeah, and I think we will, yes, we are going to talk about process. We will talk about, of course, we'll talk about, rock and coming into being. We will also talk about relationalities between Black and Indigenous communities, and the resilience that each, I always want to remember the resilience and highlight the resilience that each community has in their own right, and also this coming together. I also want to say that, and I said this to Michael, I'm like, we had not met. I know you through your work. And so I actually feel, and I feel like, oh yeah, I know Michael, but I actually don't know you like this, but I know you through your work. And so I do feel like our spirits have connected in a way previously. And now we're on screen, we're actually speaking to each other in words, but sometimes artwork, as we likely have all, imagined or felt, can do a little bit even more than words can. So today we'll do words, but know that our spirits I think have met before. And same thing with Quentin. Quentin, I know his work, definitely our spirits can have connected through artwork. And so I think we all have that. And both Karen and I have written extensively together, edited. And so this love that we have for each other is through art and being, so in relation. All right. So artists, do you want to say anything? Let's ask, do you want to share something, a little nugget that we didn't share yet, or anything, or even just a hello? Nope. Okay, we can dive it right in.
Oh, we're on mute too there, Michael.
Both are on mute.
Can't unmute.
Oh, okay. Right.
So they.
Yeah. Right. Can someone someone has to unmute our mics. I think a spotlight or something has to be put on. Okay. It's like, no, we don't hear anyone. Of course we don't, because we are the only two off mute.
Here
Okay,
we
can you hear me
go.
now?
Yes, Michael.
There we go.
Wonderful.
No, I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah, no, it's totally gone. Happy to be here. Yeah, go on.
Okay, we're happy to host you. This is very exciting. What about you, Quentin?
No, I definitely want to say honored to be here. This is really exciting. As I know that this is something that we kind of indirectly, collectively dreamt up and wanted to manifest for a long time. And so this is beautiful to finally have it here, especially during this moment in time when it's really needed, you know, where society almost feel like it's at rock bottom, you know, so
Yeah.
beautiful stepping stones and building blocks.
Yes. And I think some of this thinking, you know, when we looked at, when we had previous conversations about Afrofuturism and Indigenous futurisms, our conversations went to the stars, and we started talking about like shapes and forms and materials gathering, and what are the shapes of the constellations, and how do we think about our relationship in terms of this sort of sphere as mimicking or reflecting those shapes of constellations. So the gatherings of material rock forms, for example, in circuitous fashion for Cree folks, for example, or Indigenous folks, you know, thinking about how the rock actually gathers us into relation in some ways. And I'm wondering if, is that okay, Audrey, if I just kind of jump in with a question? Yeah, okay, great. I'm wondering about like what is this experience with these forms, with these material forms that you work with? I know that rock has sort of like hard edges in a lot of senses. It's edgy. A lot of it is like when you think about meteorites and meteorites falling, rocks go through a process, a journey. They get kind of shoved up against with glaciation, but they also get smoothed out by water, right? So rocks go through all of these transitions and all of these changes. And I'm just wondering, like, when did you first, I guess, fall in love with rock or with meteor or with that kinship? And can you tell us a little bit about that moment? Michael Belmore.
Okay, all right. I think to begin with, I was invited to do an exhibition at Harbourfront Center with Carla Garnett as a curator, and the show was about water. And so she asked me to respond to the ideas of water, and especially to do an outdoor piece around the Harbourfront Center. So I did this piece called Brine, which was essentially 10 steel stands with salt licks. They're basically urban salt licks. So there are these 10 stands with these sort of copper tops, with these sort of carved salt white blocks sitting on top. And then in the top of the surface of the salt, I carved the words that describe the landscape before before settlers, before colonialism. So it sort of described the area before development. And I always forget what the words were. There were 5 of them. One was forest, one was meadow, one was stream, one was shoreline, and then there's another one. I forget what the other one is. I always forget one. And through the process of having them outside, so basically in this salt, I carved in these words, and then throughout August in Toronto, when you get those nice big rainstorms that roll through, those words disappeared because of the rain hitting the salt and dissolving the salt, which then corroded the copper, which then corroded the steel. And so the whole thing sort of blistered up and rusted, and the copper was patinaed. And so all of this happened. And so then, the forest is gone, the shoreline is gone, the stream is gone. And it's sort of a reflection on not only sort of the change in landscape, but also in a way talking about how materials have conversations with each other. So it's sort of, the Gardner Express, this all came about like looking at the Gardner Expressway. So looking at the Gardner Expressway and all those parts that fall down, all that concrete, because really what's happening is that there's a deep conversation between steel and salt and water and concrete. So and through this whole process, water seeps in, it starts to corrode the steel expands because there's a process where the steel basically starts to crystallize, and there's all these technical things that there is a direct conversation between materials, and those conversations inform how we exist on this place. And so for me, that was sort of the start of how I got to this idea of, oh, this is, we are actually just in a small conversation, in a larger conversation that we're sometimes totally unaware of. So we are, there are these, the Gardner Expressway was having a huge conversation with the sun and the rain that we had no part in, except for the fact that we positioned these materials into this conversation. So in a way, we sort of set in motion this conversation. And so for me, that's sort of where my work started, where I started to really look at materials and started to examine what they meant and how they converse. There.
I love it. I love it. They were put in the material. I wrote it. How the materials have conversations with each other. The thinking about and thinking through that process and what you just described there. It's just so beautiful to think about that. And often we see the corrosion, we see all this, but we don't think about that conversation between materials. And so, thank you for articulating that.
And then also like thinking through like at Michiganing, where the fishing weirs are right underneath a bridge, and then thinking about the material form of the 1,000-year-old wood that's underneath the water. And then you've got that bridge over top, and the kinds of conversations that are futurist conversations, that are conversations in the past, and all of these different forms. I think that's like, wow, it's almost like world building, but also being aware that these are conversations that we might not ever be like a part of, but they're happening all the time around us.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. You're brilliant. Like, what a way to start, right? But my mind is already like,
oh, the Gardner Expressway. Oh, how beautiful. Yes.
yeah,
Quentin, would you like to add?
Yeah, definitely. Wow, like Michael, you took my brains in so many different directions. I love it. But to go back to the original question, where I first fell in love with rock, actually a lot of people don't know. I think Audrey does because I talk about it sometimes. But the whole reason I became an artist was because I was actually interested in becoming an archaeologist. When I was a child, there was 2 movies that really inspired my entire trajectory, which was Indiana Jones and The Fifth Element. And for those who may have not seen Fifth Element, it's like one of the first like examples of like Afrofuturism in a film, where you see like there's a Black president, galactic, intergalactic president. There's representation of indigenous peoples. There's all this like really beautiful, interesting things going on, despite the white savior complex. But that's besides the point. My interest in archaeology really made me understand rock as a storyteller and keeper of knowledge, like a griot, in African traditions, and how the reasons we would inscribe things into stone is because they can keep it. They can keep those understandings, those understandings and overstandings. And so I was really interested in this idea of sediment rock, how it will preserve fossils, how igneous rock would preserve gems and create gems within them. And this whole idea of like keeping this secret of the earth, you know. But then my other interest within rock was the actual definition of what a rock is very fluid. And what I mean by that is, like, as our technology advances, as we may continue to explore the new frontiers, whether it's the ocean or outer space, or the heavens, we're going to come across new things that will redefine what rock is, but then also the way that other people outside of Earth may understand what a rock is also will change. So that definition, I understand as rock, is very fluid. And so I have like 20 meteorites, and to someone who looks at these meteorites, they'll be like, oh, that's just a piece of rock from the sky. And it's like, is it? How do you not know that this is not the bones of a planet? How do you not know that this is not a computer chip for another living planet like Echo, if y'all follow Marvel? So anyways, so I've been interested in how can the stories that I am aware of and that I value can meet a middle ground with the stories that the rock already preserves, and the stories that's already embedded in this rock, and how do these data now converse with each other? Because every time you use your computer, everyone who's on Zoom right now, in this space right now, we're all using the technology of rock in order for us to interact, right? Because everything that we have that comes from technology came extracted out of cobalt or some type of rock type of substance. And so, yeah, so with that said, like I was just really interested in how these materialities and how these different aspects allows us to understand ourselves deeper, but then also connect to our ancestors in a deeper way, whether it's the elements or our ancestors who lived before us.
Thank you. Karen, do you want to share how you came to rock as kin?
Sure, I'd love to. So I was at a conference actually in Alberta, and it was an Indigenous feminism conference. And I was sharing some of my thoughts about rock, about a particular rock actually. And it turns out that it was this, it's called the ironstone. And it's an ancestor of mine, apparently, that I didn't know about. And it's this billion-year-old meteorite. And it's got like the side of a face, and then it's got a buffalo, it's like a face, and then there's buffalo fur on the side of this gorgeous meteorite. And it was a place where Dakota, Blackfoot Cree folks used to visit, and it was a very sacred ancestor. And so this rock actually was then, it was prophesized that if this rock was ever to be removed, that Cree people would experience like famine, disease. And of course, it was removed by the missionaries. And they actually brought this rock to the University of Toronto system at a college just trying to think of where it was. It was close by, and it stood at the entrance to this college. And when that rock was taken, that's when a lot of the hardships happened. So the prophecies were true that when that rock if it was ever displaced, then things would start to happen. And so it was part of, I believe it was Victoria College that they had it here. And then I started thinking about meteorites and rocks. And a lot of our sacred kinships have been actually blown up, right? So there was Buffalo Child Rock, which was blown up to make room for a man-made waterway at Lake Diefenbaker. And that meteorite was exploded. And I saw, in my mind, I saw all these fractals kind of flying everywhere. And my own story is that I was adopted. So I was part of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 70s scoop. And I landed in Southern Ontario. So meteorites always held sort of like power to me to kind of think about how I landed in place. Because I think about that meteorite that was taken from Saskatchewan and taken to Ontario. So it's a very kind of like close relationship that I feel that I have with them. In some ways, I picture this little baby riding on this meteorite like through the sky and landing. But I also like to think about landing into place as being alongside land-based knowledges for Indigenous folks and Indigenous diasporic folks. A landing, a process of landing, and to really think about what is that process of the fall, or what is that process of emergence or becoming that rock also embodies and embraces. So what about you, Audrey? How did you come into relation with rock as kin? Or
Yeah, thank you. So when I was little, at a younger age, I was we had a garden at home. So my dad would garden, and I would always be, this is like 3, 4, 5-year-old, big frilly dresses. My mom would dress me in, and then I would go into the garden, and I would sit there, and I would be with soil, and for some reason, I felt that I could hear soil. I know that it's as a young age, but it did continue. And so I felt like that was my connection to my ancestors. I was connecting through land, through the feeling, that sediment of, of the grain, and that smell of earth, that really, really just that rich, kind of, earthy, grounding soil. And so I felt like I could connect in that way. And it stayed with me as I would just randomly collect, as I, grew older, collect stones. I've got, one from each of my travels to mark almost that, that being of, that ancestral being, wherever that was in that land. It's like, oh, hi, here you are. I can, that conversation that we could have through rock. And it was just so, it was so natural to me, and that earth that I was digging in. And as I came into ceramics, ceramics is like playing in mud. It is, and the central frugal force of being on a potter's wheel, and that connection to circle, that connection to center, where I think, or I feel like rock is at the center of our earth and of being, and being with kin. And so, and that also that equal centering of rock, and that equal, when you get on the potter's wheel, you're going in a circle. And so that equalness to center, I also feel is something that has communicated with me very, very deeply. And then the process of the fire, Michael, I think about your work with copper and the fire that that is part of the ceramics process, that creates a rock out of something, the ground. Out of a rock comes a rock, really, and what that does to a material. And coming to peace with that material, because it, those conversations that you have with clay and with being and your hands, and allowing those conversations, like you were talking about, Michael, like those allowing, and actually I was part of the conversations, but not really, like it really was, my creative gift that was happening, in that processing. So it's a combination of speaking to ancestors and being with kin when I'm with rock, and with definitely with earth as well. So yeah.
yeah,
Thank you.
I wonder also about that, like, relationship with copper, the copper and the rock. And I guess my own thinking as I witnessed your work, Michael, is to think about like processions and movement. I think I can relate to copper in some ways as I'm witnessing your work. Are all the detours in edifice, particularly, I think about detourist thinking, and us who are detourists, like we are the the embodiment of a detour for those of us who have been adopted and who were raised in non-Indigenous families. So, but edifice, in terms of witnessing what that conversation between copper and rock makes possible, can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what was that like to witness that relationship? And did it surprise you, or like, what was that like for you?
I think that being from the North Shore Superior and having that relationship to the Lake Superior itself, the water, I wanted to sort of, I'll get to your question. I just sort of wanted to talk about sort of when I first used stone, because I sort of talked about materials, but you know, the connection to stone was actually creating a piece that I did for an exhibition in Ottawa at an artist run center. And I was asked by the curator to, if I had ever worked in stone, and I said no. And then it was sort of like, well, have you ever had any ideas about working with stone? And I was like, no. And then I woke up the next morning and I was like, oh, wait, yeah, I did. And I was like, you know, it was like, I have, and it was very much about a memory. And it was about this memory of sort of experiencing how rocks roll on the shore, and about how they're rounded over a millennia, and how, you know, they in a way look like, it's like I have a memory of looking at the water and watching the sort of the foam dance as the wave recedes, and you see this foam patterns that dance on the surface of the water. And then I was like, oh, I want to make a connection between these two experiences. One, that sort of rolling of the rocks by the water, but then also the water creating this foam. So I wanted to take these white rocks and carve them so that they fit together, so that they look like foam dancing on water. And so that was the end result of that piece. And then it was like, okay, this is what I want to do. So then I produced the piece. And then over time, just thinking about sort of the history of treaty of the North Shores, like it was sort of to look at how very much the Crown's interest was in resource extraction. So it was very much about controlling resource. And so for me, that was sort of where the copper came in. Because on the North Shore Superior, there's copper and gold and silver mines, and I wanted to sort of put that in there. And so, you know, I have some iterations of early stone carved pieces that have that copper, silver, gold in them. But then, you know, once I did the copper, then all of a sudden it was like, whoa, you know, I could really, you know, it was amazing sort of to realize it was fire. And then from that, I started to really look at, so on the south shore of Lake Superior is one of the few places in the world where you can find natural copper. So natural copper is like literally there's a rock. I have some examples in my studio of basically you can walk and find a nugget of copper. And there's and most of it has been mined and removed, but there is still some that you can find. And so for me, it was sort of that connection. And in looking at sort of and researching copper, sort of looking at how we utilize it and how it's part of us, and again, how we've pulled these resources from the ground. And, you know, as a community, we you know, pull these materials. You know, we make those things that are in IKEA as a community. And so those materials are drawn from the ground. And you know, you think about copper and what its ability to be conductive, to carry electricity, to charge our batteries, to, you know, it is a connector. It is, you know, it is our television. It is our, you know, it is the first fire, and it's the current fire. You know, it has that connection to it where it is able to, you know, have that electricity run through it. And I always feel like that moment when you go and you're traveling and you go into a motel or a hotel and you turn the TV on, it's like, oh, it's like you're starting the fire. like, okay, I'm in a place I don't know, so I'm going to start the fire, and the fire is always just whatever is on TV, and it's because you want that light, and that's one of the things that copper offers, is this idea. It is like fire, so it is what keeps out, the darkness, and keeps us warm, and it does all those things naturally through how we've decided to have a conversation with it. So we use it in this particular way, and we've decided, and we've built our society around this material and other materials. And I think that connection to I think where there's an interest. I mean, I'm interested in granite. I love working with granite. It's a difficult stone. It's a hard stone. It's very cranky would be a nice word to use. And it's, I'm just thinking about sort of like when you're working with a stone, it is a conversation. And I just lost my train of thought. I was wanting to answer your copper and stone. I just wanted to say that's what I wanted to say, was that, when we talk about stone, we are only talking about its existence in one form. We always say, oh, the stone is 4 billion years, 3.6 billion years old. It had a life before that. It was liquid, it was fire. It was literally under the mantle, swimming around free. It was lucid, it was able to do whatever it move and flow, and it became solid. And so for whatever, 3.5 to 4 billion years, it's been stuck in one particular state. And that's our experience with having conversations with it. And what is the reality of how can we converse with it when it's been in this state for only, in its mind, only 4 billion years, I think that's kind of what I'm interested in understanding, is sort of, well, yes, looking at the past and examining where that comes from, but to be able to have a measure that looks into the future, but to realize that our measure is only part of existence. So when you talk about granite, that was so much the other direction that we don't even consider the other part. There's a whole other story before that. That's, we didn't get the prequels.
I want to quickly just add something to what Michael was saying. I don't know if there's something in your culture that there's like a folklore similar to this, but so for my Joshua Glover statue, the stone that the pillar is made of, the column is made of, is actually from Zimbabwe. Like I deliberately picked that stone for its attributes, but once I found out that it was from Zimbabwe, I was like, oh yeah. And it's called galaxy stone. So it's a very specific type of granite. And I was like, oh my God, perfect. But and it was perfect because when I went to Zimbabwe, like I was really interested in the type of stones that they had and how they use stones to like build villages and all these different type of methodologies of using stones and rocks. And within their folklore, they speak about the rocks communicating with their ancient ancestors and essentially telling them how they want to be used, And so as you were talking about copper, it reminded me of my experience of like being told that rocks communicate through frequency and vibration, and can tell us essentially how and what to be used for. And this is essentially what's been passed down ever since, so that every time you hear that phrase, the rock cried out, it's quite literal for the people of Zimbabwe.
Thank you. And Quentin, could you, on that note, could you talk a little bit more about your Joshua Glover piece? This is a fairly new piece, actually marking an escaped slave who used the Underground Railroad, and had and actually worked at the Montgomery Inn here in Toronto. So could you talk about the sculpture and your process a little bit more? You've touched on a little bit, and so thank you. Speaking about the Zimbabwe, the rock from Zimbabwe, but a little bit more about the cyborg arm, like all of these different elements that, that can come into play.
Yeah, I see a comment, someone pointed out, true granite is not Genesis. So great, thanks for giving that point. Yes, they are not metamorphic rock for people who may not know what that means. So they're kind of like stay in that state that they're in, which is beautiful, right? Which is why we should never take granite for granted. Yeah, so Joshua Glover, that was definitely an interesting feat to come across, because originally I didn't want to make the piece, and I speak about this in a documentary that was released by Heritage Toronto. And I didn't want to release a piece because I felt like there was too many narratives, I felt like, about the slave narrative, about the enslaved African, the enslaved person. And that is not everyone's history. For me, being of Jamaican descent, that is not necessarily a large part of our history. And coming from the Caribbean, and also my wife being directly from the continent, like those parts of there's so much more to our stories. And so, I almost didn't want to do it. And essentially, I had a dream where Joshua Glover threw a rock at me. And he stepped through a portal. Like if anyone saw, Marvel Endgame, how like Thanos steps through the portal, it was kind of like that, but he came through like all like elegant and regal, and he was just like, boop, and just kind of hit me and was like, pay attention, and that's what I had the vision of what it needed to look like, this proud gentleman who's passing through time. And the reason why we're honoring him, the reason why we remember him, is because he helped to expand our imagination. So that's essentially what that piece was meant to do. And so I tried to tell multiple parts of his story through the bronze sculpture, of not just him being once enslaved, but him once being treated as a machine. And so that's why the cyborg arm represents the moment in time where he was not seen as human, was seen as a machine, seen as a robot, and how he reclaimed his humanity by expanding his imagination. And so that's where we see the hat with the hibiscus flower that represents his African roots. But the pattern actually on the hat, the texture on the hat, is actually a design that I made of a hibiscus flower kind of like sprouting out, and it's kind of like representing like the blooming, but also his mind blooming and recognizing he was more than his circumstances. And so it once goes from that, and you see like, he has a tattered shirt to represent him being on the run, but also being imprisoned, and then eventually being broken out of prison by a community of abolitionists, and then brought to Canada, and where he found refuge in Etobicoke, which is why we know about him now. And so a lot of the sculpture was storytelling, but also combining all these elements together, and really wanting to allow people to bear witness to his history, but also how his history reflects on our history, which is really about allyship, right? How a community saw this person not as a runaway slave, saw this person not as a slave or a former slave, but saw a human being in the circumstances that he didn't deserve to be in, and worked together to help him, because he didn't get his freedom on his own. People worked with him and helped him, right? They broke him out of prison and smuggled him into Canada, right? So, and you don't just do that for anyone and everyone, right? So it spoke to who he was as a human being, but also people affirming his humanity. And so definitely honored to be able to tell that story beyond the headline that most people are used to.
Thank you. And also another important element that I think of this sculpture is his freedom papers and his books that you actually depicted, right? It's like, wow, like that freedom, and freedom that came at, a high price for many of our ancestors, but he had it, right? And then that knowledge that he's carrying, and that he is these opportunities that he has, and that he's brought to so many of us actually, to actually be here and be doing this work. So I really appreciate that. And I agree with, there are a lot of narratives of slavery and being, and this, you know, that part of history and enslavement. But there's also so much. There's also so much joy, and I think this sculpture does both of those really, really well. And so I really wanted to take a bit of time to talk about that. And I also think about you know, it is an Afrofuturist sculpture. It is looking back, and Afrofuturism is absolutely looking back, but then also presenting and futuring, and also honoring the past, but looking to the future. So the sculpture is it encapsulates all of that and more. So thank you for that. That's here for
I want
us.
to add one more thing.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to add one more thing, because a lot of folks don't know, and I speak about this in the documentary. Shameless plug about the documentary. I worked very hard on it. But the unveiling and the whole thing was almost pushed to next year because the Zimbabwe Galaxy Stone was delayed, and essentially, if there's no plinth for it to go onto, you can't do it. And essentially, the delay was so bad that they thought that it was going to arrive during the winter, which we can't obviously install it during the winter because, of course, Canadian winter, horrible. And so, yeah, thanks to the ancestors, it came in a week prior to obviously the first Emancipation Day celebration, August 1st. And so it came literally like a week prior to. They had to clean it up and then make sure it was the right height and everything, and make sure they had all the drillings right and everything. And we literally installed it like several days just prior to the unveiling. So it was like really like fresh. But it just spoke to the power.
I think another thing that I was thinking about as you're speaking is this process of the install and of being in relation with the curator's vision of the work, and having conversations with curators about the space that the work is going to be installed in. Are there any, I know a lot of this might be personal, but when you're installing a piece that's so precious and has a life, what does that feel like for you when you're installing work in an art gallery, or if you're installing the work in like a national park, for example, Michael? What is the difference there? And can you talk a little bit about that letting go-ness? How do you offer something that's so precious to you to a gallery, and then know that that gallery is somewhere there and that you're sleeping over here and you're in relationship with this being? What does that feel like for you?
I think I've been lucky enough to have had conversations with the institutions that acquire them. So there are relationships there already, and those have been always at the forefront. I think that, working with the Parks Canada and having works in, national parks, that was a process which was talking about glaciation, was talking about the idea of the movement of stone and the history of the movement of stone. And so my project, which was part of Landmarks 2017, it was sort of wanting to displace rocks in a way where it sort of, again, followed the history of glaciation, but also in a contemporary sense. So my proposed piece was to go up north and then basically carved rocks that are carved and fitted together and then copper leafed in between. And these were large boulders. The logistics was 2 trains traveling from up north, bringing them south. And it was a crazy schedule. And it was like, okay, and on this train, we're going to put 16 rocks. And then on this train, we'll put and it was like, okay, we had to crate up these rocks. And we went up there and we started in June because that's springtime up in Churchill. And basically it was still 5 feet of snow at the end of June. And it was just like, this is exciting. Okay, learn to carve in the nice cold weather. And I've learned to carve in the nice cold weather. And it's okay, it's fine. It's, snow is part of the conversation. But, those experiences, and even, installing, there's always been a connection between my work, sort of working with stone and working with water. I don't actually ever work with water, but there's always an implication of the presence of water. And I think for me, that's one of the things that speaks to the future, but also to the past. So it's sort of looking at, I think earlier we were talking about this idea of sort of looking at the sky and looking at constellations. And I always think about, there's a spot on Manitoulin Island for me where there are all these pockmarks in limestone, and in them basically water collects. So if you're there and it's just finished raining, then you have all these little tiny, almost like constellations of these pockmarks in the limestone that are these patterns with lines connecting, and then they're all filled with water. And then in that water, you see the reflection of the sky. And so, in Anishinaabe sort of teachings, there's the sky world, and then there's the world that's beneath the water and beneath the land. And then there's this third place, which is basically somewhere in between those two. And that's where we live. And our existence is that little paper thin sort of realm that is between where the sky is and where, under the water and under the land. And it's like finding that spot and being able to see it. And that's one of those things where it was like one of those moments where I go, oh, I can see that. And so that was really important. And to get back to, the institutions, it's sort of, I think mostly I build relationships with people, and so with the institutions, I don't produce a lot of work. I will say that, and a lot of my work is very time consuming, and so it's sort of like these things where I don't produce a lot of work. So when that work is placed, I feel fairly confident at where it goes. So, my babies always go to a good home, because otherwise I wouldn't send them. So it's sort of, that's the important part.
Thank you for that generous response.
Yeah, I definitely love that last sentiment that you said, like, like being mindful of where you're sending your babies, and it makes me think of like when you asked that question, I thought of my parents, of like how they act every time I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to Germany. Oh yeah, I'm going to so-and-so. Like, and they're like, wait, you're traveling for art? Like, what? Wait, like, do you even know anyone there? Like, just random strangers are paying for your flight? I don't understand. Like, so so sometimes I feel like my parents, how they felt when I just travel around the world. Sometimes that's how I feel with my art. But I definitely would say, yeah, building relationship with those curators, building relationship with those spaces, those park planners, corporations, et cetera, are like so essential, because it allows you to feel at ease, but also making sure they understand what the work is meant to do. Specifically for me, my work is very ancestrally based. So it's like a rock. It's not meant for me, you can't own a rock, because you can only borrow the rock, but you can't own the rock, because a rock can't be destroyed. You can break it into small pieces, but pieces of the rock is always going to be there, and it's always going to be there long after you're gone. And so for me, when I think about the messages that my ancestors are giving me to pour into my work, I recognize those messages. I can't own that message. No one can own the message, right? And so we're borrowing this message for this moment in time, but that message is going to pass on. And so in that same thinking and in that same vein of understanding, I have to make sure whoever is borrowing the work also understands that this work is not necessarily for you. You may have it in your home, you may have it in your gallery, you may have it in the park, you may have it in your facility, but the message is beyond us, you know. And so making sure that that understanding is there. When I say understanding, it's like a spiritual comprehension. You know, that allows me to feel at ease of being like, okay, yeah, my babies are going to someone's place who I know and trust, you know. So yeah, I'm very of where I allow my work to go, you know, and so far it's been working out.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there was like there was a piece that I did in North York. It's with Concord Development in the city of Toronto. It was part of a development park land area, and I was invited to come early in the process where they were putting in high rises. And it was sort of, they had been removing rocks, unearthing rocks from the ground as they were putting in the foundations. So they invited me to come down and have a look, because they had seen some of my work previously, and they said, well, we'd be interested in having you look at these rocks and see, you know, maybe what we could do together as a collaboration. And so I went down and looked at them in the middle of winter, and basically it was like, oh yeah, I can work with these. And so in the end, it was sort of the piece that I produced was called A Gathering. And essentially it's the rocks that are on the property, pulled from the ground, and then those rocks are carved on the surface to have sort of mimicked sort of details of how water would flow on the stone. So there is very sort of water imagery on the rock. And these rocks are just sort of sitting there, and they're next to, you know, they're in a kid's playground next to the splash pad. And it's sort of like one of those things where the rock can sit there and visit with the kids, because it's a nice warm spot when you're wanting to warm up, because these rocks warm up really nicely in the sun. And it's sort of one of these things where also it was like, for me, it was sort of this idea of a gathering, or sort of, you know, to imagine that, you know, a glacier had picked up these rocks, because I use different rocks from different places. Like that's one of the other thing with glaciation, is that everything gets picked up, and they basically, you know, it's like a really fast joyride for a rock. You know, maybe the glacier is not going that fast, but, you know, if you're whatever, you know, 3 billion years old and you haven't moved very much at all of a sudden it's like, wow, this is like a slip and slide. And, you know, they end up in North York, and there's a whole bunch of them. And they're, oh, I forget, I was doing a project out west, and they were talking about, I was trying to find some rocks to work with, and Nuisance Rocks. The quarries called the big rocks that are too big to smash into gravel. They call them Nuisance Rocks. So they usually pull them out of the ground, they put them off to the side, and then eventually they bury them somewhere else again. So it's sort of like the rock gets to come outside, see the sun for a little bit, and then gets put back in the ground. And so it was sort of, these rocks at least get to hang out with the kids and have a nice summer, have nice summers where they can share. And so for me, that was really an interesting process. And I just, you know, my carving on them, my interaction with them to put in those lines are human lines. Those are, you know, using an angle grinder with a diamond disc on it and carving those lines, again, is, you know, talking about leaving a mark for the future. But that mark for the future is also not only about sort of human intervention into the object, but also sort of acknowledgement of sort of a larger conversation. So trying to be part of that conversation, and that conversation for me has always been water and stone. So sort of putting that in there, but presenting it my way. And basically, hopefully having kids enjoy them. Kids really do enjoy them, so that's good. And a gopher always moves in underneath them for some strange reason, or some sort of animal.
Oh, I love that part. It makes me think about like petroglyphs and how perhaps also in a similar way, you know, the etching into the rock creates those pockets that you were talking about on Manitoulin Islands. And maybe it, you know, maybe it does have something to do with how water pools, and that is the conversation. I never thought about that this way. So gorgeous.
Yeah, I was like, not unmuted. Good. Okay, you know, just that idea of seeing the reflection. I always get caught by seeing reflections, water, seeing the sky on the ground. You know, seeing that blue sky on, you know, usually first thing in the morning, or, you know, I mean, that's when I really tend to notice these things. And it's, you know, it is that idea of sort of seeing the universe reflected off the ground that we're standing on. And I think that's really an important way of connecting, because it's all put in together.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
I just feel like we're surrounded by all these synapses and all these orbs,
I know.
and they're just like
I'm
all
trying to find my
over
breath.
the place. And I'm like,
yeah.
I'm
like,
thinking,
okay,
I'm
moderator
leaning
hat,
into
come
that.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we breathe into this and these stories that you've gifted us with.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so much to digest and take in and think with and through. So wow, thank you. There's a lot of comments happening in the chat, so there's a lot of love. But also we can open it up perhaps to the audience. I know there must be some questions. Like we have time for a couple of questions if we want to. And Zoe, I think we've got, and Joki, I think we've got some, feel free to turn, okay, in the chat. Great, good, I'll look out. Thank you.
It's really hard for me to not like this is like a dream conversation, and it's been a long time coming, but it's like I'm finding myself like tearing up. Like it's like these are the words that, you know, these are the connections that I think I've been longing to hear. You know, for so long, rock has been sort of like this being, this partner in some ways, these, you know, and it's so one of the big takeaways, well, there's a lot of big takeaways, but I'm also thinking about, you know, this rock had a life before this form, and that, you know, we may never know what that is, but like fire, that water, that rock has within its embodiment, all of that, and carries the memory of being on fire, like carries the memory of a burn, of pressure, of being liquid, you know, being flowing and moving in particular ways, and also being ruptured and exploded, and, you know, all of those things that the stars go through as well. That makes it a kind of a perfect companion, you know, like a perfect kinship, because they've been through a burn, you know, they've survived a burn, they've had to learn how to breathe in different ways, right? They've learned how to survive in frozenness, in stillness and movement, and they're quite adaptable to all those processes. I think it can really teach us a lot about what it is to breathe through a burn, you know, what it is to feel pressure and rupture, you know, like I really feel like they're teaching me more just by knowing all of this about them. And I'm really interested to lean more into like taking a train up north, or, you know, going and visiting Lake Superior, as well as going to visit these urban spaces to be in communion with these forms, in different forms, right? Like with your work, Quentin, you know, it feels like this big sort of like journey that we should curate somehow so we can go visiting and allow them to visit us. Like, how do they shape us into relation? How should we be in relation with them?
I think.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, you know, there's just thinking about that relationship, and I did a residency down in Australia, and I was brought down to RMIT as a visiting artist, and as part of that, I was trying to decide on how to work with something in Australia. It was sort of like, okay, I'm going to Australia and it's great, I'm here. And then it was sort of like, okay, now like a lot of my work is very much based in the land here. And so it was sort of trying to figure out how to have a connection to a place that's on the other side of the world. And then in the process, sort of looking at the industry there and looking at the stone that's there and how it's utilized and how they had like a black, I think it was called blue cobblestone. It's a type of stone. It's like, I'm not going to identify what the stone is, but it was, you know, it was a cobblestone that was used and was mined, and it has a nice blue-black color. And so in the day-to-day walking around trying to find inspiration, I sort of kept finding little remnants here and there. So then I decided, oh, well, I'll collect these remnants and I will carve them and fit them together and copper leaf them so that they look like a fire. And so I was like, okay, I'll make this sort of fire piece out of these. They're almost, I would kind of say that kind of like a lava type of stone, because they had these little pock marks in them. And so I started to collect these, and I would walk all over the place. And it was sort of like very much like, I forget, I was in Kits somewhere, and it was like, I found out later it's like 10 kilometers away, and I'd walk there, pick up some rocks, walk back, and I'd find these rocks. And it's like sometimes it was like there's a rock on the sidewalk, and you go, why is that rock sitting there on the sidewalk? And it was like, okay, well, is it somebody's rock? You know, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll just, you know, pick up this rock and then I'll walk with it for a bit. Okay, now I'll put it in my pocket. And then so I went there, and it was sort of, so I carved these rocks, and then there was an exhibition space in my studio space, and we had to go through downtown in Melbourne. And so it was easiest because I have one-way streets to just walk the rocks. And so I went with volunteers from the university, and they came and we collected the rocks. And so then we basically ventured out the door with our rocks in our hands. And Melbourne's like a nice big glass facade, buildings all over the place. And we stopped and we were waiting for the light. And I'm standing there with my rocks, like holding them. And then I have like two people beside me, and it was like, I was just sort of like turned to them, and it was like, do you feel that? And then it was like, what? And the other person, I was like, asked, do you feel that? And like she was like, what, that need to throw these rocks through that glass building over there? And I was like, yeah. And we were like, yeah, we all felt it. And it was like, we're all standing there with these rocks, looking at this glass building, holding these rocks downtown at lunchtime. And it was sort of like this really, you know, there was an energy through the stones that was talking to my head about this other material. And then, you know, eventually we walked a different direction. So it was, we weren't tempted to do anything, but it was an interesting process where all of a sudden I created a work later on about this experience where I used sort of these ideas of riot shields, but made out of glass. And then I had these little stands with these rocks that I've collected from different places or have been given to me by friends. And it was called, the title of the work was Somewhere Between Two States of Matter. No, something like that. So the definition of glass. So it's sort of the idea of what glass is, because it's sort of, it's stuck between two states of matter. So it's part liquid, part solid. And it's sort of just, and again, thinking about that history of stone and the history of how it was once liquid, how to imagine how a rock or a stone could look at glass and see it as liquid. to see it as flowing, see it as free, see it as, because it's, the experiences of a different time, of a different measure of time. So, while we might see them both as solids, perhaps the rock sees the glass as liquid. And maybe it's just a little jealous. That's what I'm thinking.
Definitely, one of the things I want to add to that is like coming out of all the things, your wonderful storytelling and the things you're saying, Michael, was relationships, and the allyship between the elements, right? The rock gives way for water, water gives way for air, rock is also formed by fire, and both of them all, and all of them contains ether, so, and then I think back to my own culture, when they talk about roots, rock, reggae, and then, how all these things worked in unison and work together, and one of the things I personally love doing is meditating by the water, and it just so happens that oftentimes where there's water, there's rocks, and so oftentimes I'm sitting on rocks, and it's through the stillness of the rocks where things are revealed to me, it's through the stillness of the roots of the sediments of the earth, where I feel like I tap into a deeper portal, essentially, or I'm transported, so I just, yeah. And then also, like, for example, seeing how like earth or plants and different things can grow through rocks, and on rocks and off of rocks, and so I just think it's really beautiful because there are so many things that rocks can teach us, and sometimes we just take it for granted or take it for granted. But yeah, like everything that you're saying just reminds me of like how much I've been able to learn from my relationship with water and rocks.
Yeah, and something you said, something both of you said, that relationship between, we keep coming back to the relationship between rock and water. And just a tiny little story, but like we were traveling, we were in Israel. We were, with my family, and my kid was, I think it was like 1.5, and we were sitting in a waterfall, and it was a rocky, rocky bottom, and he's just sitting there, and he ate and spoke to the rock. He was just sitting there, putting the rocks in his mouth. I'm like, I'm all right with this. I'm like, why am I okay with this? And people were like, he's eating the rocks. I'm like, I know, but he's communicating with his ancestors. I'm like, I was positive of it. And, and it was just like, just in and out. And, it went around his mouth, and like that communication and, he's 1.5, couldn't really communicates with words particularly, but like he was communicating and he was feeling it, and and it wasn't just any random rock, like he was actually picking up specific rocks. It was a little bit, I was getting a bit teary when I was there with him. I was witnessing this, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like you are doing this, and you're a baby, right? And kids are so tapped into their inner being and their inner spirit. And so it was just a really beautiful moment. And when you talked about, hadn't thought about that in a while, and when both of you are talking about rock and water, I'm like, my kid in the water eating the rocks and communicating in that way popped into my head. But yeah, thank you both. Yeah, wow, again. So I think we have, there are a few questions coming in. So, and I think we've got, there was one up here, I think. So shall I read it out? Maybe I'll read it out. This is more of a comment, but I'll read it out. So this is there's so much learning to be had with stone, but something that is resonating with me through this conversation is the reminder that things are much more impermanent and complicated than they seem, escaping the binary of solid versus liquid, old versus new, here versus there. And maybe do either of you want to speak to that, about like these binaries of like this old, new, solid, or these states of being of these materials? Maybe touch on that a tiny bit.
I mean, for me, I said it earlier, like the definition of rock is going to always be fluid, as our as we grow as living beings, but also as we explore new frontiers, we're going to come across new forms of rock. And so we have to recognize that rocks is fluid, but also that the rock will continue to evolve, right? So it is very much alive. And so even though we may, what the word I like to use is episteme, right? So the episteme is the amount of knowledge you hold in this moment in time. So even though in your episteme, in our current episteme, we might understand this rock as a solid state, doesn't mean it's going to always be in that state forever, you know? And as, you know, who knows, we might discover rock as a gas, you know, we might discover rock as a light. You know, there's so many different things that we have not yet experienced because of our current episteme. So honoring and respecting the rock, just as like some may hold on to quartz and crystals and rare gems and ores, like we can also look at rock in the same fashion.
I guess, yeah, I think having that binary sensibility is sort of, maybe it's too simple and too complicated at the same time. So, you know, I don't think it answers everything. I think, you know, how, yeah, I'm getting lost in my own thoughts now. Sorry. Just, you know, the imagining how we define things as just being reactions between one or the other is too simplistic. You know, when I was talking about the, you know, the Gardner Expressway, there's a long history there that, you know, of intervention into materials, and not just one material or two materials, or, you know, there's a complex sort of interactions that happen, so that the stories that are told are not so one way or two ways, or, you know, past and present. It's sort of, you know, we're living it now with, you know, seeing history repeat itself in a way that, you know, in my mind, I'm just like, how do we get to these places? How do we keep coming back to these places? You know, these circumstances that happen. Like, how do we do this? Yeah, sorry, I'm just getting lost in my own thoughts. So it's sort of like, sometimes it's very overwhelming, like how things can move the way they move. And, you know, I remember reading through, actually it was a video, watching Truman Lowe, who's an artist from, Native American artist from the US, and he was talking about witnessing water. So he was talking about sort of standing and looking at the water move across down the stream, and about the experience of knowing that the water he saw yesterday was not the water that he's seeing now, and it's not the water he's thinking about as he's thinking about it, because that water has already moved on. So it's sort of this idea of experience of how something, where you can define it as a single thing, as say water in this river, but it's not that. It's, yes, it is that water in that river, but it's continually flowing. So it's going through this cycle where it's not the same water, and it's never the same water. And I think those bigger thoughts are important. And I mean, that's what I look for. Those are the things I want to understand in my life. And I think that's part of what I want and what I need. And that's why I sit on shores and I sit there and watch waves. And, you know, there is some sort of, you know, there are details of understanding wave actions and how they go across the, you know, onto a shore. And, you know, there's this, you know, how sand can travel and migrate down the shoreline of, you know, wherever, Miami, anywhere, where, you know, this grain of sand is being picked up and moved down the shoreline. And it's a, you know, it's a pattern, and it's a migration. And I think we have that in rivers, we have that in creeks, where, you know, a rock will be worn down by the time it meets the ocean. It's a lot smaller, and it's more of it, and it's less of it, and sort of, you know, all of that is important. And I think it's being able to witness that is, or understand or perceive that is an important thing. And yeah, I'm starting to get into my own head, so I'm just gonna stop there.
No, thank you for letting us in. Really, thank you. Yeah, and I think you know, there's a chemistry teacher or a couple of teachers on this call, and they were talking about the pedagogical aspect of what we're talking about today. And imagine students learned through this conversation about sediments, about geology, about natural ways of being. That wouldn't that be, I mean, wouldn't that be a lesson, right? Like, wouldn't that be, maybe there would be more, there would be absolutely more engagement with the elements and with rock and with the sciences, really. So thank you, and thank you, teachers, for being on this call and you know, taking it up in any way that you can. Absolutely. There was a question earlier, and I do want to get to it because there was a question about future projects, and I don't know, maybe Hart House team, could we maybe pop like the social handles of our artists into the chat or something like that? But would you like to talk about future projects? Quentin, I know that you've got a Carnegie Hall piece. That's a I guess that's a present project. I know that there's so many other futures. And Michael, you've got some other things too. But could you maybe would you take a few minutes to speak about projects that you've got on the go?
For sure, for sure. Well, before I do that, I want to ask Karen a quick question. What do you call a rock that never goes to school? Don't think too hard.
I don't know. What do you call a rock that never goes to school?
A skipping stone.
Nice. I'm holding one right now. How did you know that?
Oh, the rock.
And
the rocks in my room told me.
The answer.
But
I love it.
There's an answer to that in the chat. You should look at it. It's quite funny.
Supplementary. Nice. And for folks who don't know, I often come up with these dad jokes, these puns. So I have a bunch of them lined up for Michael and Audrey later on. But for a project, one project I would like to promote and let you all know about is a public art piece coming up for Artworks TO. We're actually installing 8 portraits that we commissioned, my organization, Black Speculative Arts Movement. We commissioned 7 artists, in addition to myself, to make portraits of Black and Afro-Indigenous leaders who has parks around the city of Toronto or the Greater Toronto area. And so we're actually installing them, and actually we're going to be having rocks laid out in front of them. And we're going to be led through different ceremonies with Indigenous elders. And so that's going to be happening very soon. I did a portrait of kind of a cyberpunk-esque inspired portrait of the Blackburns, or the Blackburns who were the couple who helped to bring taxi cab companies to Toronto. So they were kind of like the Uber before Uber, and essentially they helped to uplift the Black community and the Indigenous community. And so that project's coming up really soon. We're going to be doing the installs, I believe, in either end of March or April.
What am I doing? I'm doing things. I'm carving rocks as soon as it gets warm enough for a project that's dealing with sort of the Great Lakes. It's an exhibition it's a group exhibition in University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So I'm working on that, and that'll be a collection of the meandering rocks, bubble, foam, dancing on water kind of piece. So I'm working on that. I'm working on a public art commission for the city of Peterborough, which will be about the treaty signing of the first communities that were the signatories of the treaty area. And so it was sort of in the park. It's in Millennium Park, which is downtown Peterborough. It's sort of where the treaty was signed. So there's sort of a reference to them. So I'm going to carve larger boulders with copper leaf in between, and then have images of their actual their symbols that they used for when they signed the treaties. So that'll be in the spring, and there's a bunch of other things. I'm just sort of, yeah, everything's coasting along nicely. I just can't panic. That's all. I'm just not going to panic. I've shown Zurich, which is another very odd place to have a show, but it's sort of, again, a gallery, a museum there that I've built a good relationship with, and they've sort of been very supportive of my practice for years. And so they invited me to go back, and we're doing an exhibition. They're doing an exhibition on trees, and sort of like very much an educational programming process. And so they're asking me to talk about my treaty area. And so what I'm going to do is return to actually doing drawings, because I used to draw a fair amount. So I'm going to draw not only the treaty areas of the North Superior treaties, but to use the words that are in the treaties to describe land. So in each of the treaties, there's a written text that outlines what the treaty area is. And so it's sort of like from this river to that river to the headwaters, from that, and it uses very English, ye old English kind of phrasing. And so I wanted to do a drawing of the area topographically, but then impose that sort of the words, so you can see the words into the image. So it's kind of like hidden into it. I can see it in my head. I know how it's going to look. It's going to look great. I just got to figure out how to do it physically. And it's one of those things where you just do it. And so working on that, and in that, so when I go to Zurich, I'll actually go to Zurich and then do a map of Zurich as well, and then impose their description of how they see their own country and its boundaries. So that's what I'm working on.
Gorgeous. Amazing. Absolutely. Wow. Amazing. Both of you. Wow.
Yeah.
I think that, it's going to take some time to reflect upon this conversation and really kind of think through, like, what are our next moves, So I'd like to thank you both for these incredibly generous offerings tonight. And it's a real dear, precious thing to be able to witness this. And I'm just very grateful that you're both well, and that you're both doing the work that you're doing and thinking the things that you're thinking, and being generous enough to offer, these gifts to us. So I feel incredibly honored to be a witness to this. And also just to say that if there is anything that we can do to help support the work, please let us know. Anything, like, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, for me, I'm so glad that we have come into this, this world building, as we were calling it, and the meetings that we are having, the conversations that we're having, and the witness that we are
Michael?
No, I'm good.
Okay, thank you. You've offered a
Well,
lot,
I do
and
want to ask Michael a question.
Oh.
Mr. Michael,
Mhm.
when were rock puns the funniest?
I have no idea.
During the Stone Age.
Oh.
Well, thank you, Audrey and Karen, for having me here. Both of you rock, and it's been an honor.
Gosh, these puns. Yeah, good.
Oh,
Yeah,
geez.
thank you, and thank you to everyone that that joined us on the conversation tonight.
Thank you so much, Quentin. You have missed your calling clearly. Yeah, those puns. It's great. Great to end on a smile. Thank you so much, Karen, Audrey, Michael, Quentin. This is really amazing. There were a lot of comments that I was trying to go back to. Audrey, thank you for going back to the one about the upcoming projects, because I had a note about that. So I always want to promote and push what's coming up. There was somebody who made a comment. She is I had to write this down, hydrogeologist. Sounds like a big word. I'll have to look up exactly what that is. I've heard of both of those things separately, hydro and geology, but not together. So who just made a comment, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that she's really enjoying the conversation and getting a much different kind of perspective on the rocks that she deals with on a regular basis. So and again, so much learning about rocks. I really enjoy the conversation about water. I was completely relating, Michael, to your story about having rocks and seeing a glass building and wanting to throw them, not because that's happened to me, but this is what happens to me when I'm by water and I see a nice smooth rock and I really want to skip rocks on the water. Like it's automatic, you know? So, and again, as I said in the beginning, really reminded me a lot about the conversations around lichen and how everybody gravitated to that part of the conversation last year. And it just makes total sense as we kind of uncover and unearth our connection to lichen and to rocks. And then finally, and I'll just end it here for me, these are just, there were so many ideas and comments going on, but was thinking, I think, Quentin, you were talking earlier about archaeology and about hieroglyphs and petroglyphs and stuff. And I was thinking, I immediately went to Adinkra Symbols because I'm really into Adinkra Symbols right now. Having just been lucky enough to go to Ghana a couple of times, most recently a couple months ago, and just how prevalent it is there, and just how much, you know, these ways, these non sort of verbal ways of talking of sharing and of communicating, are important and have persevered through the ages, right? And rock is kind of one of those as well. So again, thank you so much. We're just going to launch a super quick, like a 3-4 question poll for those of you who still stayed with us. Thank you for being troopers. I know this is a long day, probably cutting into people's dinner time now, but if we can just launch the poll, get you guys to answer to the best of your ability, that will just help us in future programming.
Sorry to interrupt that. I'm not sure if you saw my message, but the polls for some reason are not working.
Oh, they're not working. Okay,
No.
so we're not going to launch a poll. Lucky you. But we've got all your great comments in the chat anyway, so I guess we can take some solace in that. We won't have the hard numbers for assessment, but we'll have some great testimonial comments. Yeah, I guess we're gonna wrap up a little bit early, 12 minutes early. I just want to say, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please consider following Hart House on Instagram at Hart House U of T, or joining our newsletter through the Hart House website. And our next event, and I think for sure Karen and Audrey, with your hip hop roots and knowledge, will be into. We're having for International Women's Day, we are having a Females in Hip Hop event, which is going to feature 3 pretty incredible women from all over the globe. And that is going to be on March 8th. That's up on our website as well. Encourage people to come and check that out. And yeah, I guess I will leave it there. Quentin, do you have like a final pun or something? No pressure. You already hit us with 2 or 3, but
don't get it. I can make them up on the spot. So
okay.
if you really want to hear the best rock pun, just give me a moment. I'll go dig it up.
Okay, well, you gave us "we're rock stars," so maybe we'll just end on that. We're all rock stars. Thanks so much, people. Have a great evening.